kick off the session, let me introduce myself. I am indeed your humble moderator of today's session. I am known as Mr. Idi Ahmed from the Republic of Cameroon. I am a diplomat by profession from the Ministry of External Relations of Cameroon and currently a professional officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs at ICYF. To this end, I cannot go on without thanking our special guest who spared so much of his time by accepting our invitation to be the speaker of this eminent diplomatic simulation training. It is a feeling of pride that invades all of us because we are very much aware of the guest speaker's tight schedule and the fact that he allocated some of his time for this esteemed session. It's really an honor for us. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the program of today is timed for only an hour due to our special guest's professional engagement and constraints. The speaker shall unveil his presentation for 20 to 30 minutes, and we shall have about 25 minutes for the question and answer session. Please allow me to remind each and every one of you that we have a whole team that is capable of identifying your questions if you are not going to click on the raise hand box. For those of you who are facing internet issues, please quickly type in your questions in the chat box and I will definitely read it. Since this short session is shorter today than the previous ones, I will do my best to do justice to each and every one of you. I know how much you are curious, but inshallah, we'll try to maximize our time. I invite each and every one of you to be specific and concise with your questions since the session is taking place on the virtual space. Added to that, kindly mute your respective mic during the session. This is to help us avoid any interruptions during the presentation by the guest speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, we are experiencing a full shutdown of our nation's economy on global stage due to the current pandemic COVID-19, which is wreaking havoc on our social and economic dimensions of our respective societies. In this unprecedented time, we are reminded of the necessity of coming together in order for us to have a common international health response to the virus. In the face of this global threat, now it is the time for enhanced cooperation and common solutions. I am particularly astounded at how well some nations are coping with it and how they're helping others to curb the spread of the virus. However, much still needs to be done, especially at the level of this global response. That's why today's topic shall focus on international experiences and global cooperation in the fight against the pandemic. All steps taken shall be explained by our guest speaker, but before handing over the mic to him, allow me to say a few things about this illustrious personality. His resume is very enriching. If I have to read all of them, I would definitely steal more minutes of his time. So with your permission, Professor, allow me to say the most essential things about you to our inquisitive audience. Our guest speaker of today is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he is also the director of Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and Texas Children's Hospital, endowed chair of tropical pediatrics. He obtained his undergraduate degree in molecular biophysics from Yale University in 1980, followed by a PhD degree in biochemistry from Rockefeller University in 1986, and an MD from Weill Cornell Medical College in 1987. He is an internationally recognized physician scientist in neglected tropical diseases and vaccine development. As head of the Texas Children's CVD, he leads a team and product development partnership for developing new vaccines for hookworms, SARS, MERS, COVID, coronavirus, and so on. In 2016, at the Clinton Global Initiative, he co-founded the Global Network for Neglected Tropical Disease to provide access to essential medicines for hundreds of millions of people. He has authored more than 500 original papers, and he is also currently the author of 4 single books, notably like The Forgotten People, Forgotten Disease, and he's about to publish the forthcoming 2020 book on vaccine diplomacy in an age of war, political collapse, climate change, and anti-science. He served previously as the president of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and he is the founding editor-in-chief of the PLOS Neglected Tropical Disease. In 2014 to 16, he served in the Obama administration as U.S. envoy focusing on vaccine diplomacy initiatives between the U.S. government and countries in the Middle East and North Africa. He also served as on the Infectious Disease Task Force for 2 consecutive Texas governors. For these efforts, he was named in 2017 by Fortune magazine as one of the 31st most influential people in healthcare, and he received a lot of awards, and he appears frequently on media outlets that are famous in the United States and in different parts of the world, including BBC, CNN, Fox News, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would not like to monopolize my speech, so please, let's welcome Professor Peter Hotez. Professor Peter, the time and virtual space is all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Mr. Ahmed, can you hear me okay? Am I coming?
Yes, I'm perfectly here.
Great. I had a research group, and I'm also a professor and dean, but I also co-head a research group that's developing vaccines for emerging and neglected diseases. We've had a coronavirus vaccine program for the last decade, and so we're developing COVID-19 vaccines. And what I want to do is kind of put our vaccine program in a geopolitical context, and I know that's been the emphasis of your organization in OIC, and I served as a U.S. Science Envoy in the Obama administration. As part of the Science Envoy program he started for Muslim majority countries. So we now do vaccine development programs with Malaysia, with Saudi Arabia, and been to Morocco and Tunisia and elsewhere. And we think actually the Middle East is a particularly interesting area of the world, and was the stimulus for writing my newest book, which has the title here, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science, and I'll explain what that means. This is the situation that we're facing now in terms of the good side of things, that we've seen big declines in the number of children dying from vaccine-preventable diseases. And a lot of this came about through an extraordinary organization that more people need to know about. I think it's one of the most effective global health organizations in the world. It's known as the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. It was actually launched with $750 million of Gates Foundation money when it first started in 2000. So people always ask, what does Gates Foundation actually do? Well, this is one of the things that they do. They actually put up $750 million in 2000 to launch this organization to expand coverage for vaccines to vaccinate the world's children. And this is a collaboration between the World Health Organization and UNICEF, industry partners, academic partners, and it's making a big difference. I mean, look at some of the numbers there, 83% reduction in the number of kids dying from measles or pertussis or tetanus. H-flu means Haemophilus influenza type B. It's not influenza, but it's a bacterial infection that they used to think causes flu back 100 years ago, but actually causes meningitis and diphtheria. So this created a lot of momentum. Those pictures that I have there on the right are these fabulous images you can download if you do a Google search. He's a Brazilian photographer that spent a year going around the world watching kids getting their vaccines. They're a very moving set of images. I love it because the expression on the parents' face is everything from hope to joy to fear. And this is my own personal experience. Back after I got my medical degree and my PhD, I served as a pediatric house officer in Boston at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And there I was admitting children every few weeks with this Hib meningitis, Haemophilus influenza type B. And we would do the spinal tap, see the spinal fluid under the microscope on the upper right there, and your heart sank because you knew there was a high likelihood this child would have permanent injury. And then you see that a series of vaccines came along. to eventually bring it down to 0 in the United States. So this was a disease that was one of the most dramatic things in my lifetime, seeing a child every few weeks with this terrible disease and then it completely disappearing. I also like this slide because it has 3 arrows on it. And that's important because it points out that one of the things that people don't often appreciate is that the first vaccine that's often released is not the best vaccine, and that vaccines improve over time. And this is going to be very relevant for COVID-19. People always talk about the race for the COVID-19 vaccine. And I say, be careful what you wish for, because history says the first is not the best. History says the first has a built-in obsolescence that eventually gets replaced over time. And that's probably going to happen with COVID-19. Our first vaccines may not be the best ones, and they will get replaced over time. And this is actually the norm for vaccines, not the exception. We've made great progress through the global polio eradication initiative, bringing it down from vaccination coverage in 125 countries in 1988, having polio, to only 3 in 2018, Nigeria, especially up in northern Nigeria, and the Boko Haram areas because of the conflicts there, but also Afghanistan and Pakistan, mostly from war and conflict, that it's blocked polio eradication. We'll come back to that. And even making great control of measles. And measles is especially impressive because measles is so highly contagious. And the way we express that, and you probably, if you've been listening to the stories about COVID-19, you keep hearing about these, I don't know if my arrow works on here, but we keep talking about these R naughts, R zeros, reproductive numbers. That means the number of people that get infected if a single individual has it. So for instance, Ebola actually is not very contagious at all. Unless you're taking care of a dead or dying Ebola patient, you won't get Ebola. Measles is one of the most contagious diseases we know about. It has a reproductive number of 12 to 18, meaning 12 to 18 people will get it if one child has it if they're not vaccinated. And that means that you have to have a very high rate of vaccine coverage. So the fact that we're getting control of measles is extraordinary. Now, that's the good news part of the story. Now the not so good news, and the subject of my newest book. And I try to make the case that while we've made enormous progress since 2000, over the last few years, we've seen a slowing of that. We're not making as much progress as we were, and in some cases, we're even reversing progress. But it's that reversal of progress is not happening universally. It's happening in certain hotspot areas of the world, and I list them here. So they include up in Venezuela and Brazil, for instance, even Texas, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The Arabian Peninsula is now a hotspot of disease, and I know that'll be of great interest to you. But I call Africa's UNWARs that I'll explain. And the point is, we're still trying to understand what's driving back disease. And this is why what you're doing today is so important, because it's geopolitical forces. It's happening in areas where either war or political instability combine with things like urbanization, deforestation, or anti-science sentiments. So mostly social determinants, mostly geopolitical determinants, and also together with climate change, but not climate change in isolation, climate change happening with these other forces. And this is very important because, when we train physicians or scientists, we don't tell them about political instability, urbanization, deforestation, or anti-science, or climate change. That's the kinds of things we do at the model OIC. But we need to figure out a way, one of the important messages for today, we need to figure out a way to get the model OIC combined with the scientists and the physicians, because we're not going to, as we learned from COVID-19, we're not going to solve this problem through public health and biomedical measures alone. So here are some of the hotspot areas. Let's go through a couple of them. So the Arabian Peninsula is a hotspot area. So when I was serving as science envoy to the Middle East, I made 4 or 5 visits to Saudi Arabia, and I would tell the leaders of the Ministry of Health and others to say, look, you're in a vulnerable part of the world because what we're seeing now, because of the conflicts in Yemen, this has collapsed health infrastructure. We've had a massive return of cholera. Yemen has been suffering one of the worst cholera epidemics ever recorded. And at the same time in Syria and Iraq, because of the hostilities there and the collapse of infrastructure, it's brought back vaccine-preventable diseases in a huge way. And including this very interesting one here that we do a lot of work on. The locals call it Aleppo evil. It's actually a disease called cutaneous leishmaniasis. It's transmitted by a sandfly. It's not a fatal disease, but it inoculates a parasite into the skin and causes disfigurement of the face. And now there's been hundreds of thousands of cases of this in Syria and Iraq with the collapse of the infrastructure there. And it's happening in part of urbanization. It's also happening with the war on political collapsing health system, but climate change also has an interesting role. For example, we're recording now some of the highest temperatures ever in this region, 50 degrees Celsius. It's collapsing agriculture. This is causing food insecurity, water insecurity, and some people say that this actually helped accelerate the hostilities there and also caused people to flee into cities. This also added to the instability. And for somewhat similar, but also different reasons, a similar thing has happened in Venezuela, where the socioeconomic collapse there now in the Maduro regime has brought back measles to South America. And this is a map of measles, and you can see how it's extending now into Brazil and neighboring Colombia. But also now as people are unemployed, they're going into the countryside working in illegal gold mining industry. And they actually call them the malaria mines because people are sleeping outside exposed to mosquitoes. And now there's unprecedented contact with indigenous people like the Yanomami and the Wayu indigenous people, and they're getting decimated by measles. So all of these forces, war, political collapse, climate change, and urbanization are happening at the same time. Another example is in sub-Saharan Africa. Jeffrey Gettleman, who's a writer for the New York Times, uses the term Africa unwars, and basically refers to the fact that it's not conventional warfare, it's basically armed banditry upon the population, the citizens of the population. So we're seeing this in some of the Boko Haram controlled areas of northern Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's been conflict. And again, it's this combination of war, political collapse, climate change, and urbanization has brought back vaccine-preventable diseases, measles and others. It's brought back widespread neglected tropical diseases, including sleeping sickness. Now you might say, well, why is this guy putting up Texas and the Gulf Coast? That's really odd, right? But again, we're not seeing war and political collapse, but aggressive urbanization and climate change is producing a rise in vector-borne diseases like Chagas disease, dengue, Zika. So I like to make the point that our National School of Tropical Medicine, which is in Texas and the Gulf Coast, is actually in a disease endemic area. Now, the other huge determinant that I haven't mentioned yet is poverty, and poverty is still the dominant driver. But even poverty has shifted. Poverty, we always think of the poorest countries of sub-Saharan Africa, right? We always think of you name it, Central African Republic, South Sudan, or we think of poor countries in South Asia and certainly such as Bangladesh. And certainly that's an issue. But we did a very interesting analysis. When you actually add up where most of the poverty-related diseases are, they're overwhelmingly among the poor living in wealthy countries. So most of the poverty-related neglected diseases, and we can go down the list, leishmaniasis and leprosy and Chagas disease and parasitic worm infections and tuberculosis, the list goes on, are actually in the G20 economies, the 20 wealthiest economies, together with Nigeria, which is not a G20 economy, but it has a GDP greater than the bottom 3 or 4 G20 countries. But it's the poor living among the wealthy that now account for this, or what I sometimes call the poorest of the rich. And just for full disclosure, this is not a concept that's widely accepted. This is my observation, and in a book that I wrote called Blue Marble Health, and now I've updated it for a free instant book, which you can write, called Poverty and COVID-19. I've adapted it to adjust to COVID-19. So it's the neglected diseases of the poor living amid wealth. And that is very important from a policy perspective, because it says it may not necessarily be a resource issue. it's an awareness issue, it's an advocacy issue, getting the G20 leaders to accept that the vulnerable among their countries are accounting for the lion's share of these poverty-related neglected diseases. And this is true of COVID-19. I mean, if you look at where COVID-19 has been striking, it's almost all G20 countries predominantly, right? It's United States, Brazil. Brazil is probably now has the largest number of deaths from COVID-19, although they're not being counted. Russia, and now Saudi Arabia is going to be added to this list pretty soon. And this is the new instant book that you could download for free if you go to Project Muse on Johns Hopkins University Press. It's called Poverty and the Impact of COVID-19, this blue marble health concept, the poor living among the wealthy. So, and why do I say the poor? Well, you know, what we're seeing in the United States is, even though it's a wealthy country, we have 12 million Americans living in 18 million Americans living in extreme poverty and half the US poverty level. And we're seeing this virus in particular race through some of the low income, poor neighborhoods of our cities like New Orleans and now here in Houston, for instance, where I am, the numbers are starting to climb very, very dramatically. Now, just a little bit of science here. As many have heard by now, that both coronaviruses, the SARS coronavirus 1 and SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19, bind to these certain receptors on host tissues and through with this protein here known as the spike protein. So if you've seen these cartoons of the coronavirus, you recognize the spike protein, which is involved in attaching to the host receptor, which is found in the blood vessels, it's found in the heart, and that's why we're getting problems that go beyond the lung. It's not only pulmonary disease, but we're seeing heart injury, we're seeing clotting disorders, some really terrible things like acute heart injury, deep venous thrombosis, stroke, pulmonary emboli, sudden death. And this is all happening because of the consequence of this spike protein binding to the receptor, which in itself is an enzyme known as the angiotensin converting enzyme. And now we're also seeing neurologic sequelae like loss of taste and smell, and we can talk about why. And now a new pediatric syndrome that resembles what you sometimes call Kawasaki's disease. The new name now that just came out is pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome, PMIS. Not very easy to remember, but we're still trying to understand what the basis of this pediatric syndrome is. And the problem is it seems to be coming in periodic waves, and the new models coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health suggest that we're going to see repeated waves of this annually, probably every winter, every January, February, where you're expecting new waves of this. But the problem is in areas where we failed to do social distancing in the United States, we're already seeing that now in many parts of the United States. So what do you do about this? It would sure be nice to have a vaccine for this, although I don't think a vaccine is going to be the total answer. Vaccines will be used as companion technologies, not replacement technologies. And COVID-19 vaccines are actually not as complicated as you might imagine. Now, we know how to make a COVID-19 vaccine. It involves, and all of the vaccines that you're hearing about all work by the same principle. They all induce an immune response against that spike protein that I showed you. And they prevent the spike protein from binding to the host receptor. And then the question is, what's the best way to induce an immune response against the spike protein? And the scientific community is divided. There's different opinions. So at Baylor, we've developed, this is a slide from Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. We're using a recombinant protein vaccine approach, but there's other approaches, such as we're hearing about nanoparticles and adenovirus vectored vaccines, DNA vaccines, RNA vaccines, but they all pretty much work by the same principle, induce an immune response against the spike protein. And our approach is a little bit different in that, so we have this vaccine center at Texas Children's Hospital and our National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. What we want to do is different. We don't necessarily want to make the highest tech, fancy coronavirus vaccine. We want to make a low technology, recombinant protein vaccine that could be used all over the world, including low and middle income countries. And we've created now a global coronavirus vaccine initiative jointly with this very interesting organization here called PATH. And PATH used to stand for the Program for Appropriate Technology for Health. They're based in Seattle. They do a lot of work at the Gates Foundation. And PATH is the organization that led the development of the malaria vaccine for Africa, the meningococcal A vaccine for Africa. And meningococcal A, Mr. Ahmed, is a huge problem, has been a huge problem in Cameroon, for instance, as part of the meningococcal belt. Well, PATH led the development of that vaccine. And now they're partnering with us to help us disseminate our vaccine for purposes of global health. So our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, low-cost global health vaccines, recombinant protein vaccines. They use the same technology that the hepatitis B vaccine uses. That's used all around the world. And what's nice about it is it's made locally in places like Brazil and India. So this is our portfolio of vaccines. My kids like to call this Dad's guaranteed money losing company because we're making the vaccines no one else will make, vaccines for diseases of poverty like schistosomiasis, bilharzia, leishmaniasis, Chagas disease. And now we've added to that coronavirus infections because 10 years ago, nobody cared about coronavirus infections and now everybody cares about it. And this is where we're worried. We're worried as this virus races through the crowded urban areas of low-income countries in Latin America and India and Africa, as this goes into Lagos, as this goes into, Kinshasa, as this goes into Mumbai, as it goes into Dhaka. These are the places where I'm really worried about because how do you do social distancing here? How do you do social distancing? You can't, right? So this is why a vaccine is going to be especially important. And again, the approach has been, well, we'll make the vaccine for the US and Europe, and eventually it'll filter down to the poorest countries. And we know that that does work, but it works over a period of decades. And how many people have to die needlessly because of that? So we're trying to work around that and figure out a way to accelerate vaccines now. So what we use is we have this program we have 2 recombinant protein vaccines for which one includes the original SARS coronavirus, which we think can be repurposed for SARS-2 because it's close enough. So this is shovel ready, and we're trying to move this now to clinical trials. And we have a new one that we're developing now that's specific for SARS-CoV-2. And the idea is that it uses a yeast expression system that's the same one used for the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that's produced in Brazil and India and elsewhere. And these are the similarities between the 2 proteins. You see they look pretty, not quite identical, but pretty close. We can superimpose the structure on the 2. And now we're filing our paperwork with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration with the hopes to get that approval and advance it forward. Now, in the U.S., this program is being led by the White House under what's called Operation Warp Speed. And it sounds like a good idea that, we're going to use Star Trek language in order to advance this vaccine rapidly into the public, but it's also having a negative effect. And that has to do with the fact that we have in the United States and Europe and elsewhere a very aggressive anti-vaccine movement. And the anti-vaccine movement alleges that vaccines, one, cause autism, and you might have heard of autism and a neurologic condition. And they claim vaccines are rushed, vaccines are not safe, and that there is a conspiratorial relationship between the vaccine industry and the government. And unfortunately, a lot of the language being used around Operation Warp Speed is helping to facilitate that. And now we have a situation where new surveys coming out from Reuters and the Associated Press with NORC and Washington Post show that about half of Americans will not take COVID-19 vaccines, even if they're made available, because of this very aggressive anti-vaccine movement. And this is something relatively new. It really took off in 2019. The World Health Organization calls it vaccine hesitancy. And it's now was listed on the WHO's top 10 global health threats for 2019 and responsible for the return of measles. So this is how anti-science is bringing back measles. And we're having this huge issue in Texas now. So in Texas, which is one of the epicenters of the anti-vaccine movement, we have over 60,000 kids whose parents are denying them vaccines because they think vaccines cause autism or they're rushed or they're not safe. And now this language coming out of the White House is accelerating this. So it's becoming a huge, huge problem here in the US. And in the US, it's quite interesting, at least in parts of the US and Texas, the anti-vaccine movement has now aligned itself with the far right wing, the extreme right wing of the Republican Party, which we didn't expect. And now people are saying that these are infringing on personal liberties, and they're resisting social distancing efforts, even contact tracing. So this is creating kind of a public health crisis through these anti-science activities. So now we're seeing this big dramatic decline in measles coverage as well. So we are going to have repeated waves of epidemics in the United States, not only from COVID-19, from people who won't take COVID-19 vaccines, but also measles and influenza and others. And I get involved in this in a very interesting way. I'm a vaccine scientist, pediatric vaccine scientist who develops vaccines, but I also, because I like to write books, I wrote this book about my daughter. So I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who's now 28 years old, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I wrote this book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, to go up against this very aggressive anti-vaccine movement claiming vaccines cause autism. And what's happened in the US is pretty awful. It's reorganized now under this individual here, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., the son of Bobby Kennedy, the brother of the president, so the nephew of President Kennedy. And he's created this organization that has the unfortunate name Children's Health Defense, and claiming that vaccines cause autism and are rushed. And they've really expanded into this whole media empire, political action committees, and they use very inflammatory language. So they use fake Holocaust imagery. You know, they go around wearing yellow stars, or they go into African-American communities saying vaccines are the next Tuskegee experiment, and they produce documentaries. They have a lot of money and they're causing a lot of damage. And they target me specifically. They've now named me the OG villain, the original gangster villain. So that's my new title. But Mr. Ahmed didn't use that title, fortunately, in my introduction. So what do we do about all this? So I think, you know, we're going to have an issue not only in the science and developing vaccines, but how we create a framework to make vaccines more acceptable. We have this rising anti-vaccine movement. And on top of that, we have this terrible new issue that's coming up that some are calling vaccinationalism. And I hope you get to talk about this during your sessions. The idea is now people are talking about the US vaccine or the Chinese vaccine or the UK vaccine. And this is terrible, right? Because vaccines belong to the world. And so when I served as science envoy in the Obama administration, I tried to push this concept that I call vaccine diplomacy, that we need to build vaccines jointly between nations. And it has to do with the fact that when Albert Sabin developed the oral polio vaccine, not many people realize it, but he did it jointly with Soviet scientists at the height of the Cold War, right after the Sputnik launch. So these two countries, the USSR and the US, put aside their ideologies to work together to develop the oral polio vaccine. And quite the opposite of what we're hearing about today, vaccinationalism. This is a very destructive force. And this is what we have to move towards, I believe, vaccine diplomacy. And I served in that role with going to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East. So we have several other vaccines that we're developing for diseases like hookworm and schistosomiasis. These are diseases of the poorest of the poor. This is one of them we're working on a variant of schistosomiasis that not many people have heard about. It's called female genital schistosomiasis that affects 40 million girls and women in Africa. It's a cause of pain, bleeding, stigma, depression. It's also a cofactor in Africa's AIDS epidemic. Who else will develop the vaccine for this condition? We have vaccines for Chagas disease, and then this Aleppo evil, we're trying to make the vaccine for that. And my hope is that we can make this jointly with some Muslim, as you say, inshallah, we can make this with Muslim majority countries. And we're having discussions with Saudi Arabia. That's created this very interesting organization called Saudivax, working with one or more of the universities. We've worked in the past with King Saud University. We're very interested now in pursuing this jointly with KAUST as well, and developing this very innovative vaccine. So I'll end there by saying, I see the future as a bit of an epic struggle, and the epic struggle is this: we are developing new vaccines, but we're failing to keep up with these opposing forces of poverty, climate change, war, political collapse, urbanization, and anti-science. And vaccines alone won't do it. Vaccines have to be paired with taking on these big 21st century forces. And again, what you're doing in the Model OIC is so important in addressing all of this. And so congratulations on your conference and meeting, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter. That was a very insightful presentation, and we did learn a lot, especially me. Very much interested at what you did at the level of vaccine diplomacy and this term that you brought up, because it's very important. And before I give the floor to our audience, just want to mention in general what our lovely professor was saying about. He reminded us that the first vaccines may not always be the best, and this is like a normal, it's a norm actually, and we need to always have different kinds of experiences and vaccines. And he mentioned that the political collapse, climate change, and urbanization do contribute to these vaccine-preventable disease, and it's a dominant, and one of the dominant driver of the issues we're facing nowadays is poverty. And you mentioned it very nicely about it in your book, which you call the Blue Marble Health, where you mentioned you have a very special word. You said it's not commonly accepted, but I think it makes sense when I myself read it, the poorest of the rich, because even where I come from, I was talking to the locals recently, and most of them, the underprivileged, they were mentioning to me that they tend to even blame the wealthy ones for bringing this virus into their respective communities, because they are the ones who were traveling across borders and across different airports. And the professor kindly mentioned about the periodic waves of this epidemic and pandemic, and it's going to happen on an annual basis, and we'll have repetitive waves of this pandemic. And I also appreciate the book you wrote about your daughter, which is Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which is very important because most of us tend to believe in some conspiracy theory about vaccines and autism together. And I'm sorry to hear that you have a really a surname, which is the OG villain. It was very interesting. And last but not the least, as you all know, the professor kindly mentioned that vaccine may be the solution, but it might not be the only solution, because it's an epic struggle. As long as we keep, it will keep failing because of the opposing forces like poverty, conflict. So this vaccines needs to be paired up. We need to develop our societies and everything. So without further ado, Professor, let me just, there's too many questions. There are a lot of students who have raised their hands. So I would like to give the floor to the first person, which is Ahmed Ben from Morocco. Please, you have the floor. Please be specific and concise so that everyone can ask their questions. Since we're running out of time, we have 30 minutes. So please, let's go on. Thank you. Ahmed, you have the floor.
You're on mute.
No,
I can't hear you very well.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, Mr. Peter, for your. Actually, it's really a brilliant presentation. I got a lot of information here, and because it's is the field of my studies, so I got some information in this field. I just have some questions. So, for example, in the United States, some laboratory like Moderna or National Institute of Health are developing some vaccines like the RMNA 1273 or ENO 4800. So these vaccines, I'm actually thinking about the disponibility of these vaccines in the other world. So, for example, the countries or the countries that are or the states in in Africa, for example. I'm from Morocco. I'm an African. I'm an African guy. So I'm thinking about if they found this vaccine, for example, this week, when we will get these vaccines, and if we will get it, and how
Would you like to?
how we can get it.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, and the answer is, well, maybe your children or your children's children will get that vaccine, but it's not going. It's,
yeah, exactly. Because
no one's going to. No one's going to prioritize it for Fez or Casablanca, I can promise you. So this is why we're making a low-cost global health vaccine, like a recombinant protein vaccine, easily accessible, easily scalable, even potential for manufacture in Africa someplace. Morocco, has a lot of science capacity. The Institut Pasteur, Casablanca, and I've been there and elsewhere, great research universities. So this is why we need this. And so we're still, even though everybody signs these UN declarations that say we're committed for global access, the practicality is this is not anybody's priority, and why we feel the need to take it on our own to develop these global health vaccines. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your response.
So, Professor, would you like to take like a series of questions, or you would like to answer them one by one after?
I'm in your hands, whatever you prefer.
I
like seeing the young people in the course, so it's sort of nice.
So what I will do is I'll take maybe a series of three questions, and then
okay.
Yes, we'll have like different seance of that. Okay, let me take the next question. Let me have Mr. Hussein Amran from Bangladesh, please.
Hi, my name is Hossein Arman. I'm from Bangladesh and currently studying in the US. So thank you, Dr. Dr. Peter. And I have two questions. One is like, how should like Gulf countries with millions of migrant workers redesign their public health measure to save migrant workers from the future pandemic? Like the migrant workers at the hardest hit by the COVID-19. And also, this is a second question. It is a curious question. The people like who have recovered from COVID-19, do they have to take vaccine if available? And do you think it could trigger anti-vaccine movement?
Well,
thank you okay, Professor, you can go ahead. There's no problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms, you're right. In the Middle East, there are lots of migrant workers from countries like Bangladesh and Philippines and elsewhere, and you're right. They're vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they often live in crowded conditions and have higher levels of exposure. And so I think this is a problem that the world is facing. And it's going to be really important to vaccinate those populations as well, and to make certain that they have adequate health care. So I know that doesn't totally address your question, other than the fact if you look among the vulnerable populations to not only COVID-19, but all emerging and neglected diseases, that's migrant workers, immigrants, but also indigenous populations. These are the ones that often suffer the most. And I think the WHO, the World Health Organization, or as they say in French, OMS, is committed to this, but it is a huge undertaking. In terms of immunity, I do think people who get this virus, most of them develop a protective immune response. So there may not be a need to vaccinate them, but I also think there won't be much risk in boosting them if they also get vaccinated. But thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. The next question, can I have Mr. Yasir Ahmed from Ghana?
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Jamaldin Yasser, and Mr. Peter, thank you very much for the presentation. as you are saying, a vaccine it's not for a country, but as we're having a challenge, the US is trying to bring a vaccine, Russia is trying to bring a vaccine, like US is also trying to bring a vaccine, and people are looking up to these countries that these vaccines are for the countries. Is there a threat for these upcoming developing countries when they're raised to develop a vaccine?
So your question is, are there ways to provide access for these vaccines? And that's exactly what we're working on. We're very worried about this new concept of vaccinationalism, that there's a Chinese vaccine or an American vaccine. We've never done that before. We really need to think about how we're going to provide global access. And and you're right. I mean, as this virus goes through Accra, what are we doing for Ghana? And this is why we're really pushing hard on this low-cost global health vaccine approach.
Thank you very much. May I have Mr. Saeed from India, Saeed Ibrahim from India? Are you there, Mr. Saeed? I think he went off. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, how safe is RNA and DNA-based vaccine like? As many people are advocating anti-vaccine propagandas, and people are saying that it might be like the GMO seeds. So how safe is RNA and DNA-based vaccine? Like Bill Gates said that they are working on an RNA and DNA-based vaccine.
Yeah, we also have a program for RNA vaccines. And what we find is this: I think as a safety issue, we don't know for sure, because our thing about RNA and DNA vaccines, there's never been an RNA and DNA vaccine licensed for human use. So we've never vaccinated large populations. So far, I think they look reasonably safe, but we'll see as we begin scaling this up. I think the bigger concern from my point of view is whether they'll actually work, because what we've learned is to get vaccine protection against SARS and now SARS-2 is you need high levels of a type of antibody called a neutralizing antibody. This is an antibody that binds to the spike protein of the virus and prevents it from attaching to receptors. So whether or not these RNA and DNA vaccines can induce high levels of neutralizing antibody, from my standpoint, that's the bigger question.
So I think we had a lot of males that have been asking questions. I need to be very fair, so I like to give the floor to a lady. Can we have Ms. Ryan Swar from Iraq, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm from Iraq. So it was a very thoughtful presentation, Professor Peter, and I'm so happy to be here. The fact that I live in Iraq, and we have seen waves in the COVID-19. So my question is here: do you think that there is waves for the COVID-19, and it might come back even if we get rid of it for a while? And also, as you have mentioned, that the vaccine might not be the only solution. So do you think that it sustains and the COVID-19 might be the future, and also it will sustain and we have to deal with it smartly? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. I think what we're probably going to see are multiple waves of this virus. That we've now are seeing the first wave, and some of the models, like for instance, the models coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health, suggest that we might see another peak in January, February of this, and maybe this will be an annual January, February peak. Now, we don't really know. It's a new virus. We've never been through a whole year of this virus, but that is one possible scenario. And the possibility also is that some of the first vaccines that we have may only be partially protective, not completely protective, especially some of these RNA and DNA vaccines or adenovirus vaccines that may not induce high levels of neutralizing antibody. That's why I say the first ones are not always the best ones. So that what it means is that even though we're vaccinating populations, it may be that we still have to continue other measures like social distancing and wearing face masks. And this is going to be a gradual process. I think we have to get away from this idea that these vaccines are a magic solution, that suddenly one day you wake up and you turn on the news and the vaccine's here and everybody can go dancing in the streets. It's not going to be that way. It's going to be a gradual process, and it means having situational awareness and recognizing that during times when COVID-19 comes back, to protect your most vulnerable populations, especially your parents or grandparents, and also those with underlying diabetes or hypertension. These are the ones that we have to worry about the most.
Thank you. Please, may I have Ms. Adina from Pakistan? You have the floor, please.
Greetings to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Peter, for this very amazing presentation. I would like to ask a question related neglected tropical diseases, and especially dengue. Where I come from in Pakistan as well as India, diseases like these, they do not have enough funds to even research on vaccines. And coupled with other diseases such as corona, this could create a really massive problem for our community. So I would like to ask, what are the advancements, if any, taking place on neglected tropical diseases, including dengue and others? Thank you.
So that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right. Dengue is a huge problem, and especially in parts of Pakistan and India now. And it's also interesting, not many people realize this, but everybody knows about COVID-19 being more severe in people with underlying diabetes and hypertension. Actually, the same is true with dengue. So dengue, one of the reasons why people die of dengue in places like India and Pakistan are those with underlying diabetes and hypertension. Now, and you're right, we need to accelerate vaccines for these conditions. And this is what I've devoted my life to, developing vaccines for neglected tropical diseases. We haven't tried to develop a dengue vaccine because some of the big pharmaceutical companies are taking this on. So there was one from Sanofi, Pasteur has developed one, but now there's a newer one from a company called Takeda, a Japanese-based company, Takeda, and it's looking very promising. So the hope is there might be a global dengue vaccine from Takeda as well. But in the meantime, places like Karachi, for instance, are going to have to suffer from multiple pandemics, dengue together with COVID-19 on top of everything else. So this is why I'm really trying to push trying to put down this anti-vaccine movement, and also at the same time really promote this concept of vaccine diplomacy. I think it's one of our most important new initiatives that no one's ever heard of, but I think we need to put it forward.
Thank you so much. Please, can I have Ms. Samar Zekir from Tunisia?
Hello, everyone. Greetings, Mr. Peter Hodges. I want to ask you about something. When they will find the vaccines, they said that they will experiment or trying this vaccine on Africa. I mean, the poor countries. So, what is your opinion about that?
I'm sorry, tell me, just repeat the part about Africa again. I didn't hear that last part. Didn't quite come through.
All right. I think that there is a suggestion from the developing countries that they will try the vaccine of coronavirus in the poor countries of Africa.
Yes, so the hope is that we can do clinical trials all over the world. And I think that's important because I think, I think countries, when you talk about access, and I talk about this in my new book, it's not only access to food and water and shelter and essential medicines, there's also a concept that I call access to innovation. People in the world's poorest countries deserve access to innovation in science, just like people in the US or Europe or anywhere else. And so I think, that's a reason why I think it's important to do clinical trials with well-controlled, informed consent for people who live in poverty. They also deserve access to innovation as well as introduction of new vaccines. And that's why we're partnering with PATH for that purpose.
Okay, please, may I have Ms. Asma from Oman?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your informative presentation. So my question regarding vaccination diplomacy, as we know that, or my question is vaccination diplomacy has driven cooperation in the times of crisis, or allowing groups and states to put aside ideological differences to eradicate COVID-19? And thank you.
Yes, that's the idea. Unfortunately, it's not happening at the level that I would like to see it. And so my point for this presentation is we did this for polio, we did this for smallpox. So not many people realize that it was US collaborating with the Soviet Union that helped eradicate smallpox. So the Soviets figured out a way to freeze dry the vaccine so we could bring it all over poor countries in tropical areas. We need to reopen this idea. This is vaccine diplomacy, I think, is one of our best hopes for not only eradicating disease, but I think it's also a way to bring countries together and also to redirect some of the science of countries all over the world to work together. It's still not a completely well-formed concept. I've been writing some papers about it. By the way, you can download, I have a nice couple of open access papers in PLOS, the Public Library of Science. So if you go to PLOS NTDS.org, stands for Plus Neglected Tropical Disease, PLOS and NTDS.org, and just go into the search engine vaccine diplomacy, you'll see a number of papers, and anybody with a computer can download it and you can print out the PDFs. And I have a nice one in 2014 on sort of the history of vaccine diplomacy, and it's an idea that I would love to explore even further. I did it as US Science Envoy, but I think doing it with OIC countries is especially important. I also wrote in PLOS NTDS, and I would love your opinion on it. I wrote 2 papers specifically on neglected diseases in OIC countries, because when one in 2009, and then I think there's another one a few years later. And so put my name in and write OIC, and you'll see some of the papers. It basically says a lot of these poverty-related neglected diseases disproportionately occur in OIC countries. And so I've had discussions in Jeddah with the Islamic Development Bank and others about how, and these diseases not only occur in the setting of poverty, but they cause poverty because of their chronic and debilitating effects. So how we can better work with OIC countries and the Islamic Development Bank to take on these diseases, I think, is going to be so important.
Okay. Dear participants, we have like at least 8 more minutes before we close the session. I'll try to do justice to each and every one of you. I can see many of you are raising your hands, but unfortunately, our professor has other things to do and we have to respect his timing. So please, I'll just take some handful of questions, and some of you have sent me a few questions. I'll read it quickly also at the end so that the professor could quickly mention about it. So let me just give the floor to Mr. Tufail Adelakum. I hope I pronounced it well, from Nigeria. Are you around, Mr. Adelakum?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, please. Quickly.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you. How are you?
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Peter. I really appreciate the presentation. It was quite insightful and at the same time educative. Professor Peter, I want to hear your opinion about the Madagascar vaccine that they came up with. And because I asked this question because there were a lot of controversies surrounding the Madagascar vaccine. We saw a lot of allegations that the president of Madagascar leveled against the World Health Organization, that they were trying to encourage him to put some toxin to the vaccine. What is your opinion? Have you tried to make a clinical study of the vaccine that Madagascar came up with? And what's your opinion about it? And secondly, Professor Peter, I want to hear your opinion about the responsibility of government in sponsoring research into vaccine. In this part of the world, we noticed that the government has not had a lot of effort in sponsoring research that our people can come up with towards this vaccine. What's your opinion about this at the same time? Thank you very much, Professor Peter.
Yes, thank you. So I don't know too much about this Madagascar vaccine. I know there's a Madagascar sort of herbal remedy that the president of Madagascar was kind of pushing, but I think the World Health Organization has come out very strongly and says this is not a cure, nor is it a vaccine. So unfortunately, you know, government leaders like to push sometimes for solutions that are not, because they think it's a quick fix, but in fact it doesn't work. We've had a similar kind of situation in the United States where the White House was pushing pretty hard on a drug called hydroxychloroquine, which turned out in larger trials is not effective. And this is why it's really important to have good collaborations with scientists. I didn't quite get the second part of the question, Mr. Ahmed. Did you kind of pick up that second part of the question?
Yeah, I didn't, but if Mr. Tufai can just mention it in 2 seconds, please, Mr. Tufai.
Okay. The question I asked for the second one was that what responsibility do you think the government of every nation should play, most especially in the developing countries, towards sponsoring research into vaccine?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I think one of the things that I've been pushing hard for is to collaboration with local research institutes. So, you know, almost every country in the world has some capacity for doing research. Certainly in Nigeria, where you are, there's some excellent universities and research institutes. You know, in many of the OIC countries, the system of the Institut Pasteur, the French system is fabulous, you know, fantastic institutes. It's really important that, you know, when we talk about vaccines, that we do it in collaboration with these institutes, either through clinical trials or even some of the science. And one of the things that I tried to do when I was science envoy for the Middle East and North Africa is to visit as many research institutions as I could. So for instance, in Morocco, I visited the universities in Fez. I was in Institut Pasteur in Casablanca, visiting universities in Rabat. The same with Tunisia, where they have the Institut Pasteur in Saudi Arabia, which has got a great system of universities. There's enormous capacity there. And I think also it represents some of the best aspects of the United States. You know, one of the things that really struck me when I was science envoy is you'd meet some of the government leaders in the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Science. Almost all of them, you know, did their master's or their PhD, they're in the US or the UK, and they did it in places, you know, not even necessarily at Harvard and Yale, but in the middle of the country at Iowa State University. And so, you know, we have all of these leaders in these countries that spend time, you know, in the real part of the United States, places like Iowa and Texas and things like that. And to me, that's a positive sign. That's our best ambassador, are our research institutes and research universities. But I don't think we don't capitalize on that enough. We don't build on that enough. And that also is part of the concept of vaccine diplomacy.
Professor, excuse me, I know we're coming to the end of our session, but I'd just like to know how many minutes can you allocate for us more, because there's still some students.
Well, I should go, unfortunately, but I have another call that I have to do. We can do one more question maybe. And then for follow-up, however you'd like to follow up afterwards, please let me know. I'd love to stay in touch with this group. It's a great group, really good questions. And if I can be of assistance to the OIC, would love to maintain that link.
Inshallah. So let me just read some of the questions I just received, just 2 of them, because I can't read everything. The first one was, how can we stand up against the demonization of vaccines in our respective communities?
I think that's a great question. And it's not always easy because as somebody once pointed out, bad news travels about 10 times faster than good news. And so being able to educate people about vaccines, why they're safe, why they're tested for safety, and to fight against conspiracy theories. And part of the problem is, you know, there is this amplification system between the internet and social media. And I think it's really important to put out really important messages. So if you're on Twitter, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Peter Hotez, but also look at some reputable sites like the World Health Organization. Twitter site is fantastic, a lot of good information. Also EMRO, the Eastern Mediterranean region of WHO. Also a lot of really useful information there. And I think, working towards building science into the OIC is going to be very important. I think science diplomacy, or what I call vaccine diplomacy, tends to be sort of the forgotten piece of diplomacy, the forgotten piece of foreign relations. We forget about the power that science has to affect change.
Okay. And the last one will be, could the virus of the COVID-19 disappear like many other viruses? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, we saw this with Zika, right? It practically disappeared from the Western Hemisphere a year after it caused a terrible epidemic, but probably not. It probably won't. It'll probably be here in annual waves. And ultimately, I do think we will need a vaccine or multiple vaccines to control this infection, very much like influenza.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear audience, please, you'll have to excuse me. I cannot take more questions. Like I mentioned previously, please don't be mad or angry at me. We just have other things to attend to, but definitely please do follow the professor on his Twitter account page, and he can attend also to your questions. I'm definitely sure of that. So having come to the end of our program, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to inform you that ICYF is an Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum, which is affiliated to OIC, and we are mandated to empower the youth in our member state country. Professor, we have a traditional ICYF to usually offer a token of appreciation to our guests. Due to the COVID-19, we couldn't host you here in Istanbul, but we are looking forward to that. We hope to have you here in Istanbul. It will be lovely to have you, and in other sessions as well. So all we can do is to thank you and send our blessings, and may the Almighty assist you in whatever you're doing in your daily task. And on the behalf of our president, Mr. Taha Ayhan, and the secretary of ICI, we express our gratitude to you, Professor, for sacrificing your time for the benefit of these enriching discussions that allow the participants to grasp an understanding of what we have to do for our international global response. We hope to see you very soon, Professor, and thank you so much. If you have anything to say, we can tell the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, inshallah, I'll have the opportunity one day to meet you all in person, either in Turkey or Saudi Arabia or any of the other OIC countries. What you're doing is so important, and you are our future in terms of bringing peace to the world and making the world a better place. So thank you for everything. I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you so much, Professor. So dear participants, thank you so much, and hope to see you. You can, bye, Professor. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.